All right, this is the Cosmos Cafe on June 25th. We had proposed to discuss multiple things based upon the 10 billion year plan. That's kind of a huge bite we've taken there. We've proposed to put a hold on that discussion. At the same time, we're going to talk about it. Um, Before we started the recording, we started discussing kind of how the sun will lose its hydrogen source, and after 5 billion years, that leaves us with half of that time frame to contemplate where humans will be. And Ed was talking about business strategy and how he was, and Jeffrey talked about this notion of an exit strategy within business. And Jeffrey, perhaps you can lead out with talking about the exit strategy for humans. We obviously need some sort of thought around exiting.
I just thought the idea is really interesting I thought it was interesting for my own life. And we just talked about the links between long-term planning or long-term visions, whether it's planning or not, because I think we're not really planning 10 billion years out, but we're thinking about it. But and what one does in the immediate. I mean, the two are not dissociated, right? So, but the whole idea of an exit strategy is interesting. So, because Ed, you were talking about the crash of 2008 and how that essentially bottomed out the business venture that you had with your daughter, and my business venture flattened out when I got sick, because you need your health to be able to run a business, and if you don't have your health, it just doesn't happen. So but those were accidental business exits. But the idea of an exit strategy is to think ahead about what those things could be or how one might manage those things. And where we are today with the ecological crisis on the planet, we are faced with an exit option. I wouldn't call it a strategy. I think we're trying to strategize ourselves to avoid that option, but it is a possibility in front of us. And so the idea is, if we do manage to pull the presence of humanity on this planet together in a way that's open to the future, what would an exit strategy eventually look like? Anyway, it's not necessarily the only question I think it needs to be asked, because I think the idea of long-term planning is also interesting.
But I think that's a good place to start there. I don't like throwing out names of individuals, but that have been mentioned on the site that we don't necessarily agree with. But Daniel Dennett, one of the four horsemen of the new atheist movement. But whether you agree with his views or not, he, in one of his last books, he did mention that our path is not sustainable. I think mainly referring to our reliance on technology. Our knowledge is sort of being stored within this, and we have no practical knowledge. So this is in case the power goes out, or in case some event happens and where the economy comes to a halt, we are not prepared. So that's he's thinking of an exit strategy in that sense. But I see this as more of a proactive. An exit strategy is the proactive form of projecting into the future before some disaster happens, and to relate that back to the Cosmos, the co-op, which was part of what we proposed here, was to reflect on what would be a good business strategy to make our group sustainable, as well as take into account environmental issues, ecological issues. And also we like these cafes, so how do we make it sustainable? at the same time that we know that there's a lot going on in the background. So that's one direction we can go.
So if we were to integrate the two ideas, maybe the question could be, how do we integrate the long-term vision into a short-term practical orientation towards the development of the Cosmos co-op? So how do you balance off the long-term view with the practical needs of the immediate, right? Because that's part of what this discussion is about, maybe.
Right. Would you like to respond, Michael? I saw you wanted to respond earlier, and I know you did work with vision and routine before, so
yeah,
that's what Jeffrey's talking about.
I need some help because I'm intersecting strategy and plan, and maybe I need help from Ed or Jeffrey. They seem to go together, but strategy is executing a plan, and plan is the big picture.
I tend to think of strategy as the principles that one puts into play in order to achieve a plan or even develop a plan. Strategy is a broader situation than a plan, which is a concrete set of steps.
Okay. But a strategy is not a vision, right? Or a strategy is
a strategy is again dependent on a vision, because a vision tells you where you want to go. A strategy tells you how you're going to get there.
Okay.
And a plan tells you what you have to do to get there.
Okay, so there's three things going on here: a vision, a plan, and a strategy.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
If one wants to break it down conceptually, yes, I would agree. Because if you don't have some idea of where you want to go, you'll never go anywhere.
That's true.
You just kind of, it's like having one foot nailed to the floor, and you'll just walk around in a circle. So if I go back to, what I wanted to be a teacher once. Well, that's the vision. And the strategy says, is all those thoughts, well, what do I have to do to become a teacher? Well, I have to go to college, I have to have an academic background, I have to learn something about a particular subject. These are all generalities, but they're kind of a set of factors and principles, if you will, that impinge on becoming or realizing that vision. But in the end, at the beginning of semester one, when I go to college, I have to decide, okay, what courses do I, because I'm down to concrete steps. And plans tend to be, and Jeffrey mentioned that, really a description of the steps that you're going to take to get to a particular point. And it's usually going to be shorter than the vision itself. Okay, I need financial stability, so I need to do this, this, and this. And the thing that trips a lot of people up about plans that I have found in my experience is they take them too seriously.
Yes, yes.
A plan is basically my best guess at how to do this at the moment.
Yes.
And 2 weeks from now, things are going to happen. We're going to get a certain customer for the business that we're running. We were doing English language training, let's say. And so we acquire a particular customer who happens to be much larger than the capacities of the resources that we have available. So now we have to think about, okay, how do we meet these needs? How do we recruit on a short term enough instructors that we can cover the classes that have to be offered? So that's a concrete step. Well, that step was in the plan. It says get teachers. But maybe the plan said, let's get teachers in 6 months. And we realized 2 weeks later, we have to start thinking about that now. So we modify the plan. So the plan's it's not cast in concrete. It's not chiseled in stone. It's kind of an outline of, if you get confused in the heat of the battle, and this is the other thing and I'm sure Jeffrey will bear me out on this, when you're trying to start a business, you have so many things on your plate and so many things in your head. Most of the time, you don't know what your own name is. And sometimes it's helpful to just sit down and go, well, we thought that we would do this, and, like, let's call it month 3. And now we're in month 3 and we're not anywhere close to that. Well, we need to revisit what we're doing. And so we modify the steps that we're taking or trying to do that. So, you can write a business plan, but you actually never finish one because you're constantly revising.
So a strategy based is to work with the ambiguity of a plan.
Well,
let me jump in there.
Sure.
Ed said he wanted strategy to get to be a teacher was to go to university, college, and then university and get a degree. That's one strategy. But he could have decided to find the best teacher in the world and go an apprentice with that teacher. And it's a very different strategy with the same goal, and it might have got him there too, but it's a very different strategy to get there.
Yes.
Okay.
Excellent point. Yes. Right. So that strategy is kind of like, what's my current way of choice to get there?
Right. I like that phrase. And I just want to jump in here because I have some experience of having a cousin that's used to teach biology for 9th graders, middle school. Mm-hmm. In the last 5 years, I've gotten her to stop being obsessed with the plan has to be set in concrete and to be flexible, or to me, because I'm coming at this really from having being strategic and having plans being always nothing solid, but they're good to work with. The example for me is I had an idea in 1977 that I'd hitchhike across country all by myself. The strategy, I was going to hitchhike. The plan of in between that simple goal, leaving San Bernardino and going and coming back, was always changing. So I don't know if that's what I'm trying to bring forth of my experience of what I feel you guys are talking about.
Yeah, and I run my plans. So my 20-year plans, I have 20 in my 20-year plans. I have a 20-year plan. I have 10-year plans. I have 5-year plans. I have 1-year plans. I have 3-month plans. And obviously the 3-month plans change very quickly. And the 5-year plans change a lot slower. And the 20-year plans changes slowest of all. So I use a kind of structure like that to manage the ambiguities and uncertainties around planning.
Yeah, and that's a strategy, though, right? Not just
that's a planning strategy.
A planning strategy, right? Okay, I think that's what I was kind of getting lost because I was going strategy planning. I was probably conflating the two words in my head.
Yeah, that's good.
But it's one of those. It's like many of the words that we use. It can be used in a variety of contexts. You can have a strategy in a chess game. In one single game, you have a strategy. There's ways of going about trying to win. Some of them are very standardized. You may try to implement them or whatnot. But there's also a strategy that a football team has at the beginning of the year on where it wants to be at the end of that season, for example. You always hear about that. Right now, they're doing the World Soccer Championships for women are going on. So there's a strategy for the team to get into the competition, and once you're there, you have to have a strategy on how it is that you want to play and who you're willing to do what with in order to get positioned for the final rounds and whatever. So it can be used in a number of ways, but it always has that general idea of I have some point that I think I want to reach. How do I get there? That's kind of the association that's there for me, and we need a certain amount of flexibility when we go from one to the other. In a business context, at least when we taught strategy in the MBA program, our goal, I think, or part of the program's goals, was to get students to recognize that there's a long-term aspect to your business, and it's good for you to know about that.
Yeah. Right.
Not just about what happens next quarter. Even if you are in a publicly traded company, you need to have somebody somewhere that has a bigger vision than the next quarter. And even if everybody else is working to achieve numbers by the end of the quarter, and that it's to your advantage for the long-term survival of your company. If people think like that, and they change over time. And you know, in the 50s, if you had asked a banker what did he envision long-term to be, he probably would have told you 50 years. If you ask a banker today what's long-term, you're never going to hear 50 years. You may not even hear years from a banker. And so that we can see how our reality has changed significantly over the past half a century or so, 60 years, during my lifetime, where what was once considered long-term is now something that some people will not even consider, let alone think about. But you do have to have some notion of what it is for you to be longer term. Even if it's for another person, go, oh, that's just midterm for me. Well, that might be for that person that's a midterm way of approaching things. Jeffrey has 20-year plans, you know. I can't conceive of having a 20-year plan, but I can see how it benefits Jeffrey for how, you know, Jeffrey approaches life. Well, that's pretty helpful too. Maybe there's something about that I could modify from my own, but I don't have to worry about it now because I probably don't have 20 years left, you know. So I'm off the 20-year hook, but that doesn't mean I couldn't come up with a 10-year plan, for example.
Yeah, but the 10 billion year plan, we're never going to get even
They're never going to
fraction of it. But it doesn't mean we can't think about it. Just like
That's
you
correct.
could think about the 20-year plan, even if you don't expect to live that long.
Well,
I mean,
that is true. That is true.
I remember my stepfather, he was dying. He was in his final stages, and we were sitting in the kitchen, and he said, well, I've ordered in a set of patio stones for next year. And I looked at him, and he smiled at me. You know, he knew perfectly well the
he wasn't going to win.
But life meant planning, you know, on an open horizon, and it was a lesson to me.
Mm-hmm. 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 That's good. That is a very instructive little anecdote. Yeah, like that.
What is the nature of the need to do this?
Because I think, it's one of the, I've been thinking about this, because people insist on memory and the importance of memory. And I think memory is really important. But I don't think it's the only thing going on in humanity. And a lot of people tend to think, well, identity is all about memory, and memory is this really important thing. And for me, even identity is not all about memory. Identity is as much about being pulled forward. It is being holding on to or catching or a trace of what happened in the past. It's perhaps more important about being pulled forward than it is about where you've been. And I think human beings are naturally in their being pulled forward. It's this idea of, I think, telos, which is the importance of the ends of things, as being a fundamental property of human life.
Yeah, and I would agree. I just asked the question because I think people don't ask that question. You know, from my point of view of just getting down and dirty of what need do I have of thinking this way? It comes from being a maintenance person that you're in the immediate present of what do you need to take care of business in this here and now. And that here and now may be like we had spreadsheets of 1 year, 5 year, like you're saying, of the maintenance we're going to do on the place, you know. But I worked there long enough that we had these plans, but sure enough, because of political reasons, we didn't have the money to do them. Mm-hmm. You know, and so it always came back to what do we need to do now? That kind of thing.
I think a lot of times we end up in those situations, but that's what frustrates us about some of the jobs that we do.
Yeah.
Because we know and we feel these things need to be done. You know, if you don't do preventative maintenance, you know you're going to have a real can of worms at some point. And if
Right.
there's no money to do it, then you realize, and it's just a matter of then sitting down and say, okay, well, that's probably going to fail within the next year, and that's going to fail within the next year. What are we going to do about it if they are essential parts of the system? So we naturally, and this is one of the things I like the way, you know, Jeffrey phrased this. You know, the future is every bit as important as the past.
I agree.
It is a point that Gapser makes, and I think another point that he makes is, in the course of human development, becoming where we are today, we thought about that future differently than we do now. And I think one of the signs of, whether we call it integral consciousness or this mutation or whatever it is the fact that the future is becoming more and more incorporated into our thinking. We're becoming more and more aware that the future is important. The whole climate change debate is not about now.
Yeah,
It's all driven by a potential future, one that someone has calculated out based on memory and stored information, all those kinds of things, and go, if we can extrapolate from that, it looks like. And if that were in fact the case, what does that mean for us? And so we start acting and deciding and handling in whatever way that we do based on those future perceptions. So the future, what we're doing is we're bringing that future to the present and say, if I want to get there, and it is part of that strategic process. That's why, you know, we can talk about it in small S strategic terms. We're going to make a plan for our business, but we're also, and this is why I think human beings are naturally strategic. And I think the seeds of that's the other side of this. The seeds of that are in all of those consciousness structures that are before us. That's one of the things that keeps coming up when I'm reading, especially like this axial age stuff, because a lot of the writers talk, just like Jeffrey had mentioned, it's about the memory, it's about what was past, it's about what was there before. We have to conserve it, and there was this great leap into the unknown of some sort. Well, I think that the future's always unknown. Even back in let's call it a magical consciousness, there's a really nice scene in Frobenius describes these pygmies in the Congo draw a picture of an antelope in the sand, and when the first ray of the sun comes out in the morning, they shoot this arrow and it strikes the antelope and they go off for the hunt. Well, a lot of people interpret that as living in the now. I'm drawing this antelope because I'm hungry now. But that antelope that they drew is about some unknown, not present antelope that I am going to encounter sometime after now. Now, whether that person is thinking about it in terms of past, present, and future, like I'm describing it, I think is irrelevant, because the principle or the seeds of it are there. I don't have it now, and I think I need this or I want this for the survival of the group or whatever it is. Later, they come back with an antelope, and it has been shot precisely at the place that the image had been shot in the ritual that they had performed. So, is that a presentiation of the future into when they did that? Is this, it's very hard to describe that in any kind of linear terms. But it's not like we can just ignore that it's not, future isn't present in that present.
This activated a sense that, there seems to, along with this need, and when we're talking about the future, of a primordial need of completion, a sense of completion, bringing the future, we know completion is variable. That's one thing I feel for me is one of the things I've struggled with is, the hitchhiking across country, it gave me so much because I completed it. I made it, I had an idea, I had a rough plan, I strategized, but I did it.
Mm-hmm.
But on on so many levels, it's like there's a lot of, you're working with so many interferences or cross purposes and I feel artists know this strong. I need to complete this, not in a, just to finish it, not in a absolute, that kind of completeness. But what I hear you saying in terms of the future is that sense of open completeness, if I could put it that way. Does that make sense?
It does, but I do think it's one of the lessons of life is to learn that you can't close everything.
Okay. Yeah.
So you have to accept that some things have to stay unclosed forever.
Yeah, well, that's what, yeah, and I agree.
Yeah.
But that's why an open completeness, you still, and Zen even has a circle. They don't close the circle.
Yeah, I know that.
They don't close the circle. They keep it open. And I think, but what they're trying to say is there is this movement that human beings want to move around, move through, to bring the future to them, in a sense, I guess, as much as possible, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's as much as possible. It's like I had mentioned before. We're all mature in the meantime, and we're all growing up. But I don't think we're all grown up.
Thank God.
Yeah, I know we're not done with that. There are times when we are perhaps more childish or adolescents than others might like us to be, or whatever. And there are still mistakes that we made when we were very young. There's some things we don't get over, but it's very difficult for some people to learn to live with that.
Yes, that's
can't
true.
Close everything, and I know of a number of people who their deepest desire is to find closure about things that, unfortunately, in many instances, can never be closed. And it's a real hard realization to come to that some things just stay open, and they're going to stay open. But
yeah, I don't want to infer of an obsessive need to close things.
No, I didn't think you were like that. I'm just saying I do know people who have that.
But you follow that sense of inherent of going in a certain direction, bringing the future, of having a certain sense of, wow, I did it,
Yeah. No, that's good, because then we do close that.
A lot of this talk is reminding me of the death cafe that we did, and saying, well, death is not necessarily the end of us.
Yeah.
Or there's tiny deaths as we go throughout the day, depending on how you want to use the word. But even our biological death is not the end of us. There's still, like we're saying, some form of memory and identity. And something a term I wanted to add to that is perhaps survival. I mentioned Dennett at the beginning, and he's thinking of how can we survive beyond our shallow view of everything all at once now type of mentality. So that's, I think, almost, I don't want to throw in everyone, but people with different perspectives, from those that are Darwinian in thought, or those of us that are in the more conscious evolutionary direction, can agree that there's this element of survival that's naturally strategic, I guess, and we want to, these leaps into the unknown are reminding me of what Banerjee talks about with the post-human. It's not the Kurzweil transhumanist type of perspective of, well, we'll step out of our human bodies and do that, but the post-human mentality is seeking different strands of, well, we can control who we are as humans. So if we're projecting into the future, depending on how far you want to go, we can say, well, at some point we might not be able to survive on the earth, so we need, I don't know, an exoskeleton, a certain suit. You can go in that direction. Or even with ethics, and this goes with what Jeffrey was talking about with religion. We have those various stages of religion as well. And we're stepping into perhaps a new concept of what religion is, as we contemplate and question and say, well, this didn't work. This version of God didn't work. So what is God now? And that religion ties in with ethics and even psychology. And I think Ken Wilber and the Integral Crowd, we mentioned growing up, and we're all growing up, even as the human species, we're growing up. And what Wilber is talking about is growing up into these new forms of ethics and religion, which allows for, well, recognizing the darker sides of us, recognizing that what happened in the past may have worked then, but we can take those elements of the past and bring it to where we are now, as well as bring in the future elements. And there's nothing that has to be too fancy, nothing technological that needs to be inserted into these thoughts, though it might come up, and it's useful to think in that direction too. But, yeah, I think in our Aurobindo talks, or at least the reading of Aurobindo, is he's in this, he wants a greater psychology, and that involves being in tune with your body, that involves being in tune with the other, that involves quite a lot of work, quite a lot of growing up, I guess.
In esoteric circles, they call this what we need to do in our humanity. They call it the great work. It's kind of like the phrase that they use. And my take on that always was, it's not that it's so grandiose. It's just great in the sense that there's a whole hell of a lot of it to do.
Exactly.
You never really stop working part, you know. You just have, there's just a lot of work, and most of what we have to do is, I think, in some sense, it's not easy. It's not impossible. It's just not easy, and it's a challenge. You know, I'm sure all of us have had those. You know, you get up in the morning and you go, oh boy, it's another one. Especially when we have, you know, big plates full of stuff, or mountains that we think we have to climb because projects are due or grants have to be written and deadlines are out, you know, looming and whatnot. And the thing is that, you know, I can speak, you know, as a retiree, that doesn't go away when you retire. It gets filled in other ways with other things, but you still, all of those challenges that you had before, you know, there's not this, I know it likes to get portrayed that way, is, you know, this, you know, there's always this golden sunset out there and people are sitting in the garden and, you know, and I'm going, I don't know. Well, when does that happen? You know, some people get to go on cruises. Some people want to. Andrew had mentioned in the last cafe, he wasn't real keen about the one he went on, but he did enjoy parts of it. And part of it was, you know, the stunning sunsets that you only get over the ocean. It's like, if you want other stunning sunsets, go to a desert. You know, they're different than the ones we have here, you know, where there's a lot of clouds. Sometimes you don't even see the sunset. It just kind of fades, you know, or whatever. But we never stop working on that, and we never stop working on ourselves, and we never reach, you know, there's back to that open close thing. You know, we're open. We're just open beings, and I think that coming to the realization that it's open is a big, well, it's a help for me. I don't know if it's a help for other people, but it's a help for me because I can at least drop that one expectation that I'm going to tick things off my list that don't need to get ticked off, you know, and the other people get ticked off because I didn't tick them off. Well, then I'll just tick them off. There's about 3 levels of ticking in there.
You know, Ed, I like you brought up the fact that about openness, because I think in considering any of this stuff, I think there is this is where Kearney and hospitality, I like his languaging, that human beings have within themselves this survival mechanism. Are you an enemy or are you a friend? And that can go for any thought process, any strange new idea. as much as another person. And I think before I even grow up, I think I've only grown up when I've opened up to the mere fact that I can grow up, not in the sense of I'm a finished product. No, but every time I've grown larger in whatever sense that means, it's about how to a certain extent I've been safe enough to be open to a certain extent. I think that's that balance of what Kearney brings to the storytelling about this act of hospitality or hostility. How do I know if you're an enemy or a friend? And like I said, I don't think that's just with people. I think it's with strange thoughts, and ideas, because like you say, thoughts are things. Well, that means they're just as real as people, and I think that the more that, at least with me, I'll speak for myself, the practice of giving attention to that decision of opening or staying closed, because I think we need to respect sometimes, no, I'm shut down. I'm done. Nope, I'm done. I'm not going to open this door right now. And I may never do it. I may never go to open that door again or even try. So I'm glad you brought that forward, because I think a lot of this, I feel, I'm listening to the conversation, is I'm paying attention to my openness to what's being talked about, and it's a little bit anxious provoking, I have to say. It's just anxious provoking of even considering 10 billion years down the road. I mean, it's like a koan. Here, take this koan and bust it open. Well, I don't have 10 billion years. Like you, I know that,
I think this issue of open is related to we're kind of circling around, or maybe I'm just restating what you're already saying.
Yeah.
But for me, it all has to do with self and other.
Yeah.
Capital O, other.
Yes.
Right? So, because if we stay with the self, hey, life would be terribly boring. The only things that are interesting in the world, if they're all the same as me, I'm not going to change, I'm not going to grow, nothing's going to happen, right? So it's all about an encounter with the other. So it's part of why I get so frustrated with the current political situation around immigration, because if there weren't immigrants, there would be no other in our societies, and that would be terrible for our societies. So I mean, but also in this long-term perspective, and this issue of closure, it's a movement that we move from ourselves out to the other, and then we bring that back to the self. And if we bring the other back to the self, then the other becomes part of the self, and we have to find a new other to engage with, right? So this is constant movement between the self and the other, and different transformations that are going on through that. Yeah. And the long-term view for humanity is a question of otherness. I mean, the long-term, it's how do we continue to keep ourselves open even that long in the future, right? I mean, so for me, Doug brought this up around this idea of the 10 billion year plan, but I have to say that I think I might have mentioned this before, but I read a book many years ago. It's quite a remarkable book and quite controversial, called The Physics of Immortality by Frank Tiptree, who's a cosmologist. And the book is a kind of an argument that humanity could eventually, if we set ourselves to do this, could re-engineer the universe so that we make for ourselves a place where we can live forever inside the universe. So it's this engineering on the largest scale I'd ever seen when I read it. and it's still way out there and considered quite kooky by a lot of people. But I always liked that the breadth of vision involved in that understanding, or that way of looking at things. I actually don't agree with a lot of his actual arguments, and some of his assumptions along the way, I seriously doubt whether that's the way the world is. But I've never questioned the interest of that kind of. So this is a $10 billion argument. 10 billion, not dollar, 10 billion year argument. Even longer in terms of because he says, eventually we have to propagate humanity out across the planets and the stars and engineer and galaxies, and he's eventually get to the state where we reconfigure the masses in the universe to set up resonating waves that become standing waves, and within those standing waves at the scale of the universe, you then install computational structures or whatever that allow humans to become sheltering structures for human minds to enter and then live eternity. So, I mean, it's a wacko idea, but it is this kind of very broad, and so it's part of what drove me in the writing of my science fiction saga. But one of the things that and which is partly focused on these questions of long-term religion, but one of the things that has come out more or less has emerged on its own in my own writing of these books is that I started off with the idea of maybe one religious future or different sects, so there are different sects in my stories than the ones today. There are different combinations. I have a Buddhist Catholic sect. I have a Taoist Islam sect. I have these odd combinations of today's religions and it taken into the future. So but all that is only one religious future. But then there are other religious futures that emerged from the writing. So I wrote this whole thing on, it's another crazy idea. It says ideas of a Dyson sphere, which is a kind of, a Dyson sphere is if you build a shell around a star, then it creates a huge, huge, huge surface on which you can establish a civilization. It's absolutely ginormous. And what I proposed is that a group of people set up a biological environment inside this Dyson sphere with the goal of creating a small god over millennia, over many millennia, right? By evolving in because the space is so huge, they're able to evolve many different ecosystems that almost never interact. And so they're experimenting with different evolutionary mechanisms. And eventually from this context, there's something that emerges that they're not sure whether it's a god or what, but it's some being of some sort. And so I have all these different understandings of what a religious future would look like. And it comes back to this idea that maybe we're too oriented towards a one future approach, one kind of future. Even all the standard religions see their own future, but they don't see the future in relation to the other future, the other religions. I mean, the Buddhists have their own idea of, the Christians have their idea of what is important in the universe and where it should be going, or where it is going. The Buddhists have their own idea, and you may find, I certainly do, the Buddhists a little bit more open-ended than many of the Christians. Not always, not everybody, but even so, even the Buddhists are focused on a single vision of what the universe and where it is going. But I don't think humanity is built that way. I think we're built to have many, many different visions that often are in completely different directions. So I think that's kind of that's why
Well,
I'm
and that's
interested in
that's
this
tied to
long-term view.
that's tied to your about identity too.
It
Identity
is.
is trying to find one fixated identity, you know, a statement. This is who I am, and that's just that's that. I don't know how to respond to that, but in my experience, that's just not real. You know, in my
Although
experience.
it's very popular still.
Oh yeah, it is. It is very popular. But that the Christian mystics and Buddhism really have challenged and helped me understand that my sense of identity is not something I can ever fix or fixate on. It's always in flux. Like your descriptions of, you know, your stories and stuff, that there's this flux. There's not this one way. It's pluralistic, you know, it's plural. And that sets up the notion of self and other, and that is working with the notion of difference, you know. And like Kearney talks to, you know, quoting his people that you know, maybe if we would just relax around that, even if I know another, I open and know another, I don't really know the other in an absolute sense, but I've opened to knowing the other than through my preconceived prejudice points of view. You know, I have many different points of view on my ex-wife, and a lot of them are love, but there's some that's not, and I'm sure she has the same about me. But we created two beautiful children that are other than us. Now, that's the way I see it, trying to spin off of your description of what you were doing.
Yeah. And Kearney calls God other.
Yeah.
Which I found
Right,
really interesting, because
the big L, the big O.
Yeah, the big O. Yeah.
Yeah, I find it interesting that when you're describing this, Jeffrey, you come to a limit where the word religion doesn't work anymore.
You do.
It falls short. You realize, you know, I was rereading Gapes on this very point recently, because he says religion as a concept is only something that you can find in the mental rational structure of consciousness. So what you find in the other structures kind of looks like it. So you use the word religious. We hear the word, spiritual. Today people are looking for all kinds of ways to describe what it is that we're talking about, because it's really not religion. I think for me, since I grew up in that neck of the woods, Christianity I find absolutely fascinating, because if there is anything that is perceived as monolithic, that it is anything but, then Christianity has to fill the bill. Because there's as many different kinds of Christians as there are people that claim to be Christian. And there are so many people that I know who are Christian and who would never, it's like the people that wouldn't say shit if they had a mouthful. They wouldn't say Christian if their lives depended on it. But that's fundamentally what they are. Because of how they go about that, but it's their own unique flavor of this. It's what they've brought together and how they've opened it. And the part that bothers me about religions, when we start talking about them, we talk about world religions and Judaism and Christianity, Islam or Buddhism or whatever. They, as religions, and most of the flavors thereof do tend to be closed. It's like you said, they have one view of how it's going to end. And there's only one path that you're going to get down, and they're absolutely positively sure it's this way and no other way. And if you don't get on board, you are more than shit out of luck. You're going to rue the day that you didn't get on board with us. And I just find that so absolutely mind-boggling, because if there's anything that that you can't be sure of. This is the area that you can't be sure of. And that's why I find these other approaches, like Carney brings up when he, and he was talking about Levinas, and where he goes, well, God manifests in that moment that you feed the orphan. That's when it appears. And you were talking about creating this being. That's a long-term strategy plan. We got to implement this. And he's going, you feed the other, and boom, all of a sudden it's there. See? And I just find that an absolutely fascinating notion, because that's actually what underlies a lot of what is termed or deemed God within this religion. We don't have to worry about that so much in Buddhism, because they don't use that notionality. The Hindus approach it in a very multifarious way, whereas the Abrahamic want to zero in on one, but whatever they're zeroing in on can't be it as far as I'm concerned, because if you can describe it that clearly, what are you describing?
Yeah, exactly.
It certainly can't be whatever it is that allowed all of this to happen so that we're even having this discussion. That just, it exceeds my capacity to kind of, put it in my head. And that's why these practical approaches that we get from others, like, Carney was talking about in Levinas, I find absolutely fascinating. And this is also something, although even it's a little more structured than perhaps elsewhere, is in Aurobindo, where you can see that he's always trying to open this up. The moment you think it's not that. To use a Zen, let's say, mode of expression to describe it. As soon as you go, well, that's it. Well, I don't know what it is you pointed at, because that couldn't have been that, kind of thing. So it is and it isn't at the same time. We have to, juxtapose those, as we move forward. So.
Well, and one of the things I like about that I've been hearing, and Kearney is just, for me, it's just detailing, I've heard it other places. We do have a need for narrative, Ed. So how does this fit in? I agree we need to be careful with our narratives, and understand that we're storytellers. That's how that helps us make sense of our. But I guess what I see Kearney and Zen saying, well, that's okay. That's a nice toy, but it is a toy. It's a useful thing, but don't take it too serious. In the sense that Kearney is trying to, like his projects, because I've taken to going to his website, and because of his on-the-ground experience with division from Ireland, and this is one thing I like from him. He has on-the-ground experience of setting up of how enemies can listen to each other's story and see how much they may have in common to help move to the third story. So, but I think what this is saying is, yeah, we naturally need to describe or find some kind of making sense, but how much of it, we need to be careful how, as an artist, I just think you have to be careful of how much you try to possess and own your creation. It becomes dangerous, if I can say it that way. It's like my children. I'll just use my children. I participated in creating my children, and I've done a lot of work of going, okay, but I don't own them. Now they are of their own. It's that kind of almost, I put it in that kind of context, because my children for me, are really important, helping me grow up in the best sense of growing up, not in the absolute sense. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It makes sense to me, Michael. It's good that you were born now and you weren't born in the Roman Empire when.
Oh, fuck yeah.
when that was one of the key features of your ownership, and
Yeah.
the whole idea of ownership that we have today basically derives from Roman law, and it's interesting because a lot of people haven't gotten over the fact that things have changed a bit since then. I have a problem with ownership in general, because I don't know how we get to own anything. I don't know how that even happens. Proudhon the French anarchist, wrote this brilliant. He won the prize from the economic committee that wrote out the competition on property, and the title of his book is "Property is Theft," where he completely just takes this whole thing and he goes, "We can't own anything. There's nothing that is ours that we could possibly own. So we just made this up so that we can control, or that we can exercise power, whatever it is." And so, you can take it, to that extreme as well. And it is a fascinating read, because I have a real problem with, ownership. If thoughts are things, and one of the Rosicrucians always used the radio metaphor. Thoughts are out there, and when you tune into the right channel, you get the thought. And so, making a light bulb, discovering, inventing, a lot of those, that's why they happen in multiple places in different parts of the earth. Maybe at the same time, I think that's a fascinating thing, that they come up temporally relatively close to one another. It seems to be that those ideas are more activated perhaps at that time, but if we're getting them from somewhere else, they're not even ours either.
Yeah, right.
We can express them, and we can bring them across. What Carney's doing with his, his project is very similar to what I think was Michael Rosenberg, the nonviolent communication.
Yes, right.
They get down, and it's all about, what does it mean to listen? Is what I get out of both of them. What does it actually mean to listen?
Right,
and when I hear what you say, it might not be what you said. That happens a lot of the time.
That's true.
Rosenberg says, okay, so he had Palestinians and Jews, he worked with them a lot, sitting there, animosity, people had killed, I don't know how many of the other, it's like the Northern Ireland, I don't know how many family members the others had killed. And he goes, when they say something, what did you hear? And then you say that. And the other person realizes that's not what I said at all.
Right.
And then, and once you get them going back and forth to that point where they get on the same lambda, eventually they get on the same wavelength, they're on the same frequency, and they understand that they're really talking about the same kinds of things. That's when changes actually take place, but it's a long, difficult process to do that. And you have to be exceedingly willing to go through that, to come to that realization as well.
And there's no guarantee. This is the thing. You're working with uncertainty a lot. It's interesting. One of the aspects that you bring up that I think supports I don't know did you ever read Jung's Red Book? Well, it was quoted in Imagination by Lackman that Philemon, who happens to be the guru or wise person for Jung, looks a lot like Freud, told him that his problem was he thinks he alone has thoughts and he owns them, and that you think there's not within your spiritual, the way I understand it, within your soul per se, there is life going on that you don't own your thoughts. You're not alone in your thoughts. And what I took from it is what I think personally, what I've taken from Zen is to stop identifying with thoughts. Thought is an activity that you have to watch how you interact with. Thought is an activity. How do you interact with it? Well, I have a personal way of interacting with thoughts that I've learned to do a better job of, like how I learned how to crawl and how I learned how to walk. And I still stumble. So I like your making that clarification about even our thoughts, we don't own them. Even our feelings, we don't own them, but they're there. They're there, I think, to give us some kind of sensation to work with. What Kearney, that's why I like Kearney, is he's bringing it down. Start with sensation. There's three connotations of sense: sensation, meaning, and orientation. We're always a lot of our sense making is trying to orientate to other people. I have a friend that I listen to him a lot, and he's constantly using this phrase, and I sometimes I'll challenge him. It just doesn't make sense to me what they're doing. I'm going, JR, you're trying to make sense of what they're making sense of. So how could they make sense according to you? You know, it's challenging his common sense in a way that he brings to the table when he's listening to another person. You know, that common sense gets in the way of good listening in my book. And I'm just as much, don't take me out of the loop. I still do it too.
This idea of listening and tuning in, perhaps, or receiving the other. So right in that moment when you were talking, perhaps they were your own thoughts, perhaps they were not, but I was receiving all sorts of connections. Some seem to be my own, but they're not my own thoughts. I was receiving it from this other realm, connecting some depth of knowledge. And now that it's been processed, I will try to explain it now in this moment. But you mentioned the imagination and the imaginal realm, and something that Ed mentioned during that talk we had based around the imaginal realm, or Lockman's recording that we listened to, was the acting as if. And that goes along with the imagination, imagining the other. Kearney also mentions it when he's talking about imagination and the other, that we act as if the other is like me, or even imagining the other as something separate, that we can both become the stranger, but at the same time we are not the stranger. So we're never fully knowing this other, or this future, or this whatever it might be, but we can act as if we know it. And with that process, we can receive the other, and it will become an element of our own self, or identity, perhaps. Right now, I'm working with my 5-year-old son to recognize the other around him, the world around him. So right now, he's highly creative, highly imaginative, but the other to him, whether it's authority or parental guidance, or the world outside of him, he's not at that stage yet where he can recognize these various sense of others. So I love this trait about him. I don't know if I carried it with me when I was younger, but he is so determined to retain what he knows is true, even at that age. So anything that, from tying his shoe, something like that, he'll say, well, this is how I know it works, even though it's not working for him. And he refuses to try out new steps, try out 1, 2, 3, let's try this, which is both good and bad. But I kind of sense this breakthrough about to happen in him, or it happens in spurts, as it does as we progress in life as well. But he will begin to recognize this strangeness, that the tree in front of him is not necessarily, well, it's created by him somehow, but he didn't actually make this tree. Where did it come from? Who or what created this tree? Or nature, if you bring it out to the wider thing. Or, like I said, we have the in-laws living in the house, and he's not all that disrespectful, though there's these conflicting cultures, and some of the things he does and says we've had to correct and say, well, we are like joking around, or sarcasm is not a common thing in the Philippines, and it's seen as disrespectful. And there's certain terms you do, to introductory terms, when you're speaking, interacting, and the way he interacts, or my son interacts with my father, there's plenty of sarcasm and name calling and silliness that doesn't translate into this. But so there's lots of others being introduced at all times. And yeah, going back to the as if, another phrase that came up was "fake it till you make it," which sounds very transparent or blunt, or a bad strategy perhaps. But if you dig deep into the surface, perhaps fake's not the right word, but if you want to make it into this embodiment or mind of the other, there needs to be some sort of imagination rather than, well, just faking it. Yeah.
Yeah, because we need imagination to go 10 billion years into the future, bringing the future back here. We need imagination. And that's what I like about this dialogue that's taken place. There's a lot of hospitality to the imagination taking place. So thank you, guys.
I wanted to come back to Ed's point about ownership, because I agree with you. I think ownership is one of those things that seems to be built into our society from bottom to top, and yet has no basis except cultural. It's a cultural artifact, and people they think it's part of the nature of the world. It's not, you know. and I suspect to some extent our ecological crisis is partly, at least, you know, there are many threads that lead to the crisis, but I think our ownership values are one of the threads that are in trouble with the crisis, because as long as we can divide up the world into little pieces, and this piece I own and that piece I do not own, this piece is under my purview and that piece, and the rest of it is not, then, you know, the planet doesn't belong to me, right? But the planet does belong to me. I mean, it belongs to all of us, even though we own only, you know, we may own and some people don't own any of it, right? I mean, you know, it's the privilege that owns something of, you know, in this weird system, right? So
doesn't Gregory even comment on that, Bateson?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So
it sounds like that's something Bateson would even bring up, you know, of ownership and challenge that notion.
Yeah. So, you know, it would be nice if we could do something about ownership, but I don't think it's an easy thing to get.
No, some of the
challenge. But it may have to change. In order for us as humans to be around in 100 years. We may have to change that one, although I have no idea how we're going to do it.
Well, I basically have been forced to change it for the longest time since I had my accident, and having to adapt to changes. One of the things that was concretely part of my change is giving up the notion of ownership. Because the more I hung on to ownership, the less I was able to actually move forward in my healing process, because I was demanding it to take place a certain way. You know, I was demanding and owning, you know, over possessing, you know, that it take place a different way, and that wasn't helping me. So that's how I came through letting go of that, relaxing around that notion of ownership.
It's a little bit hard to think clearly about, aside from this recognition that is a basic cultural artifact.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's a kind of, you know, because if you think about self and other, right? So the idea of dividing the world up into pieces is an other concept. It's part of the separation of putting in separations between pieces. So it's a kind of an other concept. But the idea that you have some appropriation of one piece of that, that's a self concept. That's bringing the other into the thing, into the self. So it's a combination of other and selfness. But it exactly how you would, you know, and just as in a way the other one is, if I say the planet belongs to all of us, well, the planet as other, but the belonging is self, right? So it's a different way to do that division. So I'm not sure where this gets me, but I do find it interesting as a kind of analysis. It'd be nice to get clarity on how to make that more supportive for change, I guess.
Okay.
I think you put your finger in the wound there, Jeffrey. That
Yeah.
it is a self-other, and I think that's a really nice description. And what I heard Michael saying, and I think is an important contribution, is one way to get over the fact that it's just, I'm going to say just a cultural artifact, is trauma. Now, if we're going to multiply trauma by 12 billion, I'm not sure we want to go there, so that people come to this other realization. So we're looking for a way to make others aware of what ownership actually means. Because I agree with you, it is taken as such a given. It is one of our most unquestioned presuppositions about reality. You know, that and it's like you said, it's like it's a law of nature or something. That's the way I hear people talking about capitalism in general, which is predicated on ownership. You know, that's just the way it is, and that's the way it's always been, and it will always be that way, because how could it possibly be any other way? And
heaven forbid.
You don't have to look very deep or very far to see lots of cultures that never came up with the notion. And you know, it was. They couldn't have. They can't think of it, even if you pointed to them and go, "Oh, this is the way we do that." Then it's just, well, that's insane. You wouldn't do that. But it is exceedingly deep-seated. And I agree with you. That's one of the most challenging challenges. It's one of the deepest and biggest challenges that we have right now, is to get others to realize what is it that you are actually assuming in this moment. What are you taking as a given that seriously needs to be questioned? And it's a tricky thing as far as I'm concerned, because the moment you start questioning others' fundamental beliefs of how reality works, the reaction is not always pleasant, nor is it sympathetic.
It's hostile at times. Fucking hostile.
I didn't want to just jump over there, Michael, but you're right.
I will. I bet I will, because that's part of the risk.
Well, it is, but you're also at that moment. I mean, we have to be aware of the fact that that moment you are literally threatening. You're threatening another person's reality.
But sometimes you do it unintentionally. It's not.
Well, when I do it unintentionally, it doesn't bother me as much as when I know I'm getting down, and I'm going to say this, knowing full well that it could have very unexpected reactions to it. You know, it's not an easy thing to do. There's been opportunities where I've been in a very normal, you know, backyard talk with the neighbors.
Right.
And you know, they're having family issues with ownership about something, or inheritance because Uncle Fred died or whatever it was. And there are moments where you can bring it up and you can see, well, you've planted at least a seed.
Yes, right.
Questioning that absolutivity of ownership, that's just a given, and that's the way, you know, well, God intended it, you know. If all else fails, get God to back you up on it. Well, yeah. I don't think he does that either, except that, well, that's part of the problem that we have with the whole Israeli nation at the moment, and the settling of the foreign lands and Golan Heights and drilling for oil and settlements and whatnot, is because they think that it was said the borders were different than the ones that you human beings acknowledged in 1948.
Yeah, they start playing the culture starts playing the story, and the story, you know, Trump, this is one thing Trump does. Tell the story over and over, and people believe the story instead of questioning the story. One of the difficult things, I think, and I'll agree with you, Ed, one of the difficult things in this kind of work is that I've done for myself and, learned from others, many, is part of the training is to learn how can you be with somebody else's hostility and anger and not, I'm not saying you're unaffected. I'm just saying you're like, you've trained yourself. This is their stuff. It's bound to come up, how well can I work with it in the moment when it does? Because if you don't have that kind of strategy, going back to the strategy, then it seems to be the other way is to avoid any kind of helping each other learn. It's the great work, and the great work isn't, greatness like in a basketball store. It's greatness because it reminds me of a concrete example. When I was 16, and I went to New Mexico and I worked on a farm, and out in front was 10 acres and it had weeds. And my Uncle Olin, and I'm 16, gave me a knife and said, go and weed that field. I'm 16 years old. I cried, and my Aunt Ruth knew it. But for 3 weeks, he had me going out and doing that field until I think Aunt Ruth kicked him in bed and said, now, would you let him use the tractor? So, but those seeds, to go back to your point, literally, seeds of experience have come to help me be with somebody else's reaction that maybe I didn't intend that reaction. Just like people, I wish some people, but on this cafe, they seem to be more appreciative of when I do have reactions, when maybe I have a reaction to what they say. Anyway, one knife, 10 acres of weed.
There's another issue that brings up the same kind of reactions from people about basic reality. And it's right in the news right now. It's the gender issue.
Yes.
Gender takes us to the very core of what it is to be human. So, between the ownership is about our relationship to the society within we live, and it's at the very bottom of it, right? Mm-hmm. But the gender is also
it's primal. It's primal.
But it's also about the society and the relation with the individual.
Right.
And gender is up for discussion. Ownership is not. But gender is up for discussion. Good point. So what I'm getting to is there may be a way to link the two issues.
Okay.
I mean, they also raise ire. The gender issue, some people get angry, really angry when the issue of gender comes up. Just like they do with ownership. So there's a close tie between the two, and they are both important for the long term, because if coming back to the long-term discussion. So
the old phrase, they're hot buttons. They're very much hot buttons. The old phrase.
In my books, remember, there are 7 genders, not 2, and ownership is also not dealt with the same way in my books as they are in the current world, but it's sort of based on this idea that humanity moves away from these certain stances because it's partly about certainty.
Yes.
The whole idea of gender, different genders, or is gender fluidity, is no longer being certain one thing versus the other. And the same about ownership, no longer having this certainty of one having this complete control, which is another problem we have with this world that we live in, this idea of
control.
Which is the one that Bateson deals with in particular. You cannot, a part of a system cannot control the whole system.
Yes, that's right.
If you try and control the whole system, you will die. That's which is what we're struggling with, right?
Okay. Yeah, I agree.
I wish I had read the Michael Garfield at the end of the 10 billion years. I think talked about or read from his own essay which is posted to the forum. But he's essentially saying that we've entered some sort of point in which there's just going to be more of everything. The projection into the future isn't necessarily going to be one of these strands. It's going to be the infinite amount of possibilities that we can imagine, or it's just going to be more of what we've been doing, and it's branching off into some sort of infinite amount of directionality. And ownership and gender are two relevant issues, and perhaps one underlying cause of this rebelling or rejecting new visions, or accepting things like gender differences, or the fact that we don't really necessarily own much of anything if you start to stop and think about it, is this possible infinite realm of possibilities. And we've noted that through our interactions with technology, the state of the world, there's so many directions we can go into that it does create some sort of trouble for any one single mind to try to grasp anything and everything. No one can read all the great works. No one can read all the books that they want to, let alone talk with everybody in their own family, or achieve any of the goals or plans or strategies that they had set out to achieve. And yeah, some of us here might be able to accept a certain pathway and move on there, or others haven't imagined to a certain extent what all that means. At least for me right now, that's part of the underlying cause. We as a collective humanity cannot even imagine, well, there's this biological side of things that, yeah, there's men and women, but then we branch out into multiple genders, sexualities. I'm a proponent of, I don't really want this body anymore, and I'm waiting when we can reach that point to jump out of the body somehow. But that'll open up a whole new can of worms once we start thinking in that direction. That's perhaps 1 billion years into the future. But yeah, I just wanted to throw out that thought that perhaps that's part of what's creating so much conflict, is we can't, or it's very difficult, not that we can't do it, but collectively it's very difficult to determine where to go from where we are, whether it's politically, in quite a bit of things, even within our own sphere. And perhaps it's always been like that, but I think what Michael Garfield is saying in better words than what I'm saying now is that we're witnessing that, but even more within sciences, religion, politics, whatever it might be.
Yeah, well, there are many more educated people around today than there ever have been in the history of humanity. I mean, there are a lot of people, but there are a lot of educated people, because the level of education of the humanity as a whole has gone up. And so the more people, educated people who are thinking about the future, the more different choices there will be about the future. The one goes with the other. I think this is maybe a little bit part of what's going on in terms of, I mean, obviously with the internet and the connectivity between people, there are now more people talking to each other, at least in certain ways, maybe not always. And we all know the weaknesses of that, but there's certain level of communication that is going on.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And with that, yeah, more of the same good, positive direction that humanity could move in, and the negative direction. We see that perhaps with the techno-utopians versus, well, don't forget about the human in this picture.
Yeah, that's a living tension that we're going through. We're going through a living tension wherever we're going with our humanity. We're living in the tension of the split. Which way are we going to go? It seems to me.
or which ways, because there's maybe
Yeah,
more.
ways. Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. That's very true. That's very true.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Jeffrey. I think that's part of the dilemma that we're confronted with. There, a while back, it would have been this way or that way, or an either or would have been. And I think part of the problem that we have with whether they're techno-utopians or anyone else is you've decided there's a way, and the mere fact that you decided there's a way is for me, well, then it can't be that, because I don't know how you figured out what the way was. How is it the way? Why isn't it the Christians? Isn't there a Christian movement called the Way? So anybody can come up with a way, but it's just a way. And what we're confronted with is there are ways. And there are these multiple possibilities. And I think this ties back and loops back to what we were talking about at the very beginning with strategies. You can have a strategy to achieve some kind of vision. Well, one thing right now is we don't have anything close to a common vision. We in some instances and sometimes it seems like we're more in agreement than others, but we're still working on that. So we don't really have, not everyone's convinced that that we need to do something about our state of being. Some say it's just a natural occurrence and we'll get through it. And others think that it's existentially critical. So, we're across a wide spectrum. I don't know if humans are the primary or a secondary cause of climate change, but I do think that we should at least consider that we could be. So why don't we act as if we were and see what that does for us? We don't have to stick with anything, and making a decision. And that's another problem I think a lot of folks have, is once you decide on something, you feel that you've committed, and then changing your mind a little way down the road is somehow negating who it is that you are that made the decision. And I'm not making a case for being willy-nilly about things, but we do have to be able to change our mind. And we do have, especially in light of facts or in light of, this doesn't seem to be working, maybe we need to chart a different course. Maybe we need to modify what we thought about. Now, we don't have any expedient ways of doing that. We try to achieve, the Germans are real big on achieving consensus. Well, that's a very slow way of moving anywhere. So get everybody all shaking their head at the same time on the same points in the conversation, that can take a while. You better be, you've got to bring a lot of patience with you.
And in the meantime.
Yes, in the meantime, but there's also there's always individuals within those groups who are spending a lot of time, perhaps a la Trump, repeating their story so that you will finally agree with them, even though that's not one we want to be agreeing with. Right. So because others have recognized, well, that could also be, I'll call it a tactic in this case, within the discussion in order to, to influence the strategy. So we do have options and we do have ways, and people are trying things out, and we do have more possibilities than we had 50 years ago. So that's the upside. What we're doing with them, that's still an open issue. I don't know if we know, but I think merely being aware of the fact that there could be multiple paths and that we can pursue multiple paths simultaneously is also an important realization to make. It's not committing, it's committing to multiples. And the one that's yielding the greatest probability of success would be the one that we would probably emphasize more. But once you realize that it's not going where we think we need to be going, we have other options because we had already put them on the table. We don't have to stop and rethink everything from the get-go. We can actually modify in the course of of movement, and which is an option that I don't think I don't think my parents would have conceived of that. And go ahead.
This seems to feel like, so I'm trying to channel Gebser a little bit of the A perspective archetypal notion of the freedom of many ways, if I understand that right. Having freedom, not that having the freedom of many ways. There seems to be a natural, I'm going to say natural resistance, because we're so used to the binary either or. And what you just described is taking it beyond that. I don't think we have to leave it behind, but trying to go beyond it and still honor it in terms of making decisions is where I feel there's this intense tension of, it's just like learning something new. We're at a crux point of, and let's face it, there's some people that's going to get it and work with it, and there's some people that's going to resist, and there's some people that's going to be caught in the middle, and I think there's going to be some not nice things happen.
No, I agree with you, Michael, but being aware of the fact that they can be that way is also helpful, and living with that kind of knowledge and acting in relation to that knowledge sets a good example for others who may be having more of a challenge with it than we do right now.
But I'm going to use Bateson. That's learning to learn that awareness.
Yes.
We're having to learn to learn that awareness.
Oh,
that's what I'm trying to add to what you're saying.
And I agree. And there's a lot of folks that think you learn things, but don't recognize that the most important thing you can ever learn is to learn how to learn. And to learn and do that, because it's not something that was part of how most of us grew up. That's starting to break down. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of inherent structures that we have that have just outlived their usefulness.
Yeah,
and they're going to go away. I don't have to dismantle them, and I don't have to fight against them. I can safely ignore them because they just don't matter anymore. And you can hold on to that as much as you want. If I can recognize that you're holding on to a useless structure that's going to go away, I can make you aware of it, that you could be disappointed very shortly, but I don't have to call you an idiot if you do. No. I can just say, okay, well, and when you stumble and fall, because I know it's going to happen, I think it's my obligation, because I recognize that, to stop and help you back up on your feet again.
Yes.
That's the other side of this self-other.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that forward. Yes.
Right. If I do this with my grandson, all of that, if you do that, you're going to cry. And then he does it and he starts crying. And it's like, well, why are you crying? Well, I did this. Well, until he gets it, he's going to do a lot of crying before. He'll do more crying than getting it before a while, because that's the way you are when you're 4. Okay,
so
that's the way you are when you're 40, and that's the way you are when you're 70 sometimes.
The thing I have trouble with what you said, Ed, but maybe I didn't understand it right, was this idea that, so I have issues, I think I've talked about it before, with the idea of making decisions. I'm not convinced that we make decisions in quite the way that you describe it. Certainly, I do not. I mean, I think there are parts of my life where I do make decisions, but generally for the big things that matter, I'm never sure. And I don't really understand people who go through life making decisions and then appear to be sure of themselves. I just don't understand it, because I don't operate my life that way at all. Everything I do is always open to question, to being challenged, to being, to rethinking things. Maybe I'm just different from other people, but so this idea of it's not exactly learning to learn, it's just being open to the uncertainties in life and being willing to, because if I commit less to them, then I'm more open to switching paths, right? As I go. And I mean, Bateson talks about habit and the fact that so there are habits that form, and they're much harder to challenge, it's true. But even there, I do my damnedest to challenge them when they need to be challenged, when somebody brings it to my attention, you know? So.
Right.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, Jeffrey, and I'm glad that you brought the qualification in, because that's, even though I might not have expressed it that the way that's the direction that I was thinking. I don't think that we make a lot of decisions, period. I think that we maintain that we do. I think a lot of people that I know will say, well, I decided, and I'm like, well, okay. That's one way to phrase it, but I think something else was at work. But,
exactly.
And when I say learning how to learn, it's being open to that openness and being that it may not be this one way. If you ask somebody, if you ask, Doug's kid's going to be going to school soon or whatever, and you're going to ask them when you come, what did you learn in school today? And they're going to tell you something. But that's not really what they learned in school. That's just what they thought that they were taught or whatever. It's going to be singularized instances of whatever. Because what they learned in school is going to be this whole palette of other things that are much more important than whatever it is that the teacher was talking about. Okay, but one of the difficulties is we have is that we have also patterns of speech that we use, that are probably habitual in a lot of cases.
Right.
And so it comes across as if I'm probably saying one thing, but I'm much more in tune with what you're saying here.
And maybe because we mentioned multiple perspectives versus two, and maybe the two perspective way of looking at the world favors a kind of decision making way of framing things.
Yes.
Because I think if you know, in everyday life, you're dealing with 10 different possibilities. Gee, it's hard to, you know, you're going to take what you think is the best at the moment, and then you're going to operate, but you're not going to be 100% sure.
That's correct. But I believe that if you asked anyone, what did you do? I think most people who are living today in the circles that we're in, if you asked them to describe how they went through their day, it would look a lot like a decision tree.
Yeah, I know.
Where I agree with you, it's anything but, because they somehow, would say, highlighted or focused maybe what they have now described as a binary course of action. It wasn't binary at all. It was a broad range of possibilities, but those are the only two that were in their conscious awareness or their acknowledgement of it.
Binary in retrospect?
Well,
I think it's language partly based, because I think the language teaches us
it does
to focus in on two things rather than
we do, and that has to do with this. You know, to put it in Gapesarian terms, this mental rational, this either or. You know, one of the problems I have with these operational chains that Loeffler has in his books is that they're all just flow charts, and they kind of miss what you just described. That is one way to break it down, but that might not be the way that it needed to be broken down, or maybe thinking about it another way could be very helpful. It helps to illustrate what we're doing. But you know, I worked in maintenance analysis, not maintenance. I was the guy that was writing the handbooks that you guys were supposed to follow.
Oh shit!
Yeah, I know. You never want to meet them, you know.
What the fuck does this mean?
I know, and the point is that the whole system's constructed on digitality and binary. That's why I react allergically to it. You're more or less forced to break it down so finely that it is an either or. Yeah. And reality is never an either or. It's a whole range, and we pick and choose from that.
Right.
But when you start describing it, we fall back into these whole things, and then all of a sudden life science seems like a decision tree, and it isn't. So I agree with you. You phrased it much better than I did, Jeffrey.
So with decision making, and I'm questioning from the perspective of, or trying to enter in where the creative artifact comes in. So we know Jeffrey writes books, and at some point, once it's published, it is an artifact. The decision was made for it to be as it is. So yeah, in the background you have, well, I could have done this better, or 10 years down the road you'll say, well, I need to rework on this. But what does it mean to say that, yeah, we're always questioning and we don't make decisions in that sense, while at the same time there's this creative dimension that a piece of artwork, whatever it might be, even the strategic manuals that you're making. So that's a little bit on a different side. Where does all that come into play? But how that's me speaking again from this point of, that's why I cannot write a novel, or I dislike the idea of a completed decision. So I realized at the same time, and this also ties in with ethics or political decisions, and if we're all just sitting there scratching our heads as, well, we can't make anything final, then either nothing would get done, or we wouldn't grow up, or we wouldn't, as humans, be able to survive in a certain sense, I guess.
So I would have said maybe collectively one can come to decisions. So, for instance, you know, for the book publishing, I'll get to some point where I'll say, oh, maybe it's more or less done. And if Marco is on the other side, and he'll say, no, you've got to change this, and okay, I'll change this. And at some point we'll come to an agreement. An agreement between people is a somewhat different from the idea of taking a decision, but it does have consequences, right? So maybe, you know, I think if I was self-publishing myself at some point, but even there, I'm interacting with society. I then have to go out and distribute the book. So there's a kind of a collective process in there. I'm not sure. I'm just throwing it out as a possibility.
Hey, Jeffrey, are you channeling your archetype of being a trickster? That's what this feels like.
I'm always challenging my archetype of being a trickster.
Okay.
No, what Jeffrey was saying is very true. Even in those technical manual realms, the common knowledge was the design is finished when you break the engineer's pencil. That's how a design gets ended. Period. End of story. At some point, somebody says you're done. Now, it could be a good time to say it, might not be the optimal time to say it, whatever, but if you don't, it doesn't get finished. And Jeffrey just pointed that out. So you might make some revisions, it goes out. It could very well be that it gets changed. The book the Gapester that we read is not the Gapester that was published originally. It was changed. It's the 1961 revision. Okay, so he fine-tuned and upgraded what he had. Sure, I don't have a copy, but Hans, before the Gapester conference, asked me if I had a copy of the pre-1961 edition of blah blah. He wanted to check a quote. You know, I don't even know where you get that stuff, and it's obviously not available in many libraries. You know, so it can be exceedingly challenging to do that. But at some point, you just say, well, it's as done as it's going to be for now.
So
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it just came up. It's this, the way I'll put it, this binary of spontaneity and control. You know, nobody wants to think that their decisions could be spontaneous, for lack of, you know, because you put in a decision. It seems like the way I was trained to think of a decision is it was deliberate, and it was just thought out to the nth degree. And any notion of it being spontaneous, like, like you see a child. Watch a child. They seem to be full of spontaneous decisions, you know? So it feels like there's a tension in this notion.
Why did I do it? Because it's fun. Because I wanted to.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll put that in a real context. When I saw that things were grinding down yesterday in the decision, what are we going to do in this cafe?
Mm.
I had a very spontaneous idea. I hadn't thought about that for 1 second prior to starting to write that post.
Mm.
That was just, okay. So
Yeah.
if we have nothing else to do, which obviously we do, and we've been able to, we could do this. And it's no more than that. And to come back to own it, it's just there. If you go, nah, not for me, and John goes, I don't think I want to do that, and Gregory goes, oh, well, Jeffrey said, I don't know, maybe we could, and I'd like to, that which I think, great, because that's all it is. See, you throw it out, people go, okay, whatever. That's not the focus. That, and I'm not a very spontaneous person. I was flattered that John described it as a Gapesarian eruption, okay, but I thought that was a real nice twist of phrase in there, okay? Because something as banal as I had in my mind, that's way too much. That's way too much, okay? But it was a nice way to say it,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And you go, okay, well, but all of that leads to us sitting here this evening, for me this evening, for you guys afternoon or morning, whenever, and having a real nice chat about things that I think are exceedingly interesting on the one hand, which a word I hate, but I have to use all the time, but very worthwhile because of all the interaction that comes through and clarifying the little nuances of what it is that we're actually trying to say to one another.
Yeah.
So
right.
I found this, real helpful this evening. Also, I'll just say thanks.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it was great for me too. I feel that as a group we are a little bit. There is a quote for that, but I can't remember what it is right now, which isn't going to help you very much. But something about stumbling forward to try and find. There's a kind of a sense that we're going somewhere, but we're not quite sure exactly how to describe the process, and we're stumbling around in the dark and grabbing hold of things, but we are kind of making some kind of progression, and there is a growing sense of clarity. And I even noticed that my visions, so my long-term understanding of where we're going, has shifted since I've been part of this conversation at Infinite Conversations. I can't, I'm not sure I could fully articulate how, but I know it has shifted, so that's interesting.
Yeah. And from my where I sit, one thing I've noticed that within me, but I feel it resonates with your description, is I feel there's a behavioral shift in terms of the way we're really working with sharing these ideas and communicating them from each person's point of view, and how well we work with the nuancing, as Ed says. I feel a speech behavioral shift of really working with it. I've said this before. I mean, ever since I've been on this site, it really helped me just spending time with people of this caliber of willingness to be open to exchanging the way people language different ideas and how they land on them has really helped me work when I'm offline, off this cushion. It's really fine-tuned my ability out in the street, to put it bluntly, because this work has helped me kind of go, oh, it just verified this can happen, but I need to be around a certain group of people to help me work the process, if I can say it that way.
You can, Michael. You can say it however it is that you want.
Thank
we'll
you.
Listen.
Thank you. I knew I was in a good place.
So do we want to make a decision proactively as to where to go with the next cafe? No, I'm just kidding. I had the thought before coming on that the last 5 or 10 minutes would be a good chance to, well, we've been trying to carry forward our thoughts, and I think we're doing a much better job than in the past, when we were kind of groping in the dark of, oh, let's talk about this, let's talk about this. We're still talking about that and this, but there's a lot more bridges and connections and cohesion. We're bringing in Richard Kearney. We're going back to the imaginal realm. Before that, I think we had a meta-reflective episode on the Café. Before that, I don't know what the hell we were talking about, but it's something similar to what we always talk about.
Doug, you're doing a good job. I mean, as far as
I'm not doing anything. That's exactly all I did was simply post a crappy video, a crappy episode of a podcast.
You're doing something I decided I don't want to do.
And that goes back to the other, though. There is some otherness about all this that's going on. And I think we're recognizing that, and we're in tune with it. And
yeah, right.
And sorry, Marco and Caroline, if you happen to watch this video, but we didn't get into tangible elements. This is how all the Cosmo Vision talks go. They're more about, hey, let's talk about this. This is fun. But when it gets down to the nitty gritty, it doesn't happen. So, anyways, there's a bunch of talk we can do about that,
but people can show up at those events with Marco and like I did, and really, I think that's a neat gateway to people on this site contributing their points of view, and I think Carolyn and Marco actually needs that input from people that visit. They need to, like I did that one time, and visit where you guys came together to discuss business.
Yeah, and that threw in a few great ideas about money, if I remember, or how to manage that concept, and they've taken that into account. They're not the only ones that can take it into account. They want to develop their own exit strategy, so they don't have to be at the core, at the helm and everything. And I invited Ed to the July 4th reboot of the Cosmo Vision, just so he can provide that input. Which didn't necessarily happen today, but simply listening in to what is going on in the background, and with Ed's experience, that if he's able to attend, great, that'll be useful, and they'll take that into account as they progress on.
Resource.
Jeffrey's done his fair share of participating in, before it was called Cosmo Vision, it was, what was it, Inception something or other, or
it had a clunky title. They're always clunky at the beginning. No.
Syndicate
of Inception, right?
Yeah.
But
is that our end bell?
I just thought I'd ring it to bring it slowly down.
Well, the rapture's not going to happen here. I can tell you that, Michael. If that's what you're worried about.
Well, hey, I did get you guys to be quiet for a nanosecond.
Well, you did. You did. That's.
Yeah, I do have some things to do, so I think I'm going to go. So
I got to go.
I hope you guys have good days ahead of you. The day's over.
Always a pleasure, Ed and Michael and Doug.
Thank you, everybody.
We'll see you next time around, or wherever. Maybe we'll meet in the halls.
Take care. Hang 10. Hang 10.
Take care.